Thank you. Thank you. Too kind. I'm Russ Contreras, the race and justice reporter, but without further ado, let me introduce the only woman to be re-elected in this city, the mayor of Washington, D.C., Mayor Muriel Bowser.
Thank you.
Mayor, thank you for joining us. It is
My pleasure.
Pleasure to have you. To get started, before we get into the city's future, let's go to the city's past. Up until the Civil War, this city was a refuge for people escaping slavery. And their descendants are still here, keeping this city operated. They educate our children, they patrol our streets, they keep the trains running on time. They're the facility managers and the nurses, like your parents. I say all this because election season's coming up. And every election, politicians seem to bash Washington. It's this place, it's this horrible place, I'm going there to fix it. I know they're talking about the federal government, but do you feel sometimes those criticisms are based on race and racism?
Well, there's certainly a lot of criticisms that we think are rooted in race, but I do think that there is this distinction that we spend a lot of time making between the Washington that is the federal government and the D.C. where I'm from, and that I have the privilege to represent 700,000 people who pay taxes just like every other American, yet are deprived real representation, a vote for their congresswoman and 2 senators, and we fight that battle every day.
What is the status of statehood? Is this a dead issue, or is this still alive?
This is what I'd say, Russ. We're closer than we've ever been, and we're this close. And what that means is that we've had 2 positive votes in the House of Representatives in this session and the last. We have more support than we have ever had from the United States Senate, from senators. We have the whole regional delegation, the Washington Post, the business community, all are supporting statehood, and 86% of Washingtonians want to become the 51st state. So what it's going to take, in my view, is a carve-out on some important democracy legislation in the Senate to get beyond this filibuster, and then we can get it done.
And you got a tweet today in support of statehood, is that correct?
Yes, well, people every day learn about our status. Most Americans, they don't think about it. They don't really know that we're different and that we pay taxes but don't have a vote. And so when we explain it to them, they want to say more. And so we have a lot of celebrities, I think today, Taraji Henson, who's a DC native and a big Hollywood star, just reminded everybody we need the vote. The confirmation of Ketanji Brown Jackson brings the issue up to everybody's mind because while her nomination was being debated, we didn't have 2 senators representing us to question her. When they go to vote this week to make her a justice, we won't have any senators representing us. And so there are times like this and confirmation appointments where it's front and center in people's minds.
Now, 2 years ago, you were in praise and scorn from some people for creating a space to celebrate Black Lives Matter. We're creating the Black Lives Matter Plaza there. And there were calls at the time to rethink how we fund police. Now your administration is calling for more resources for police as we see rising crime and people complaining that they see this crime in their neighborhoods. So I ask you, is this a reversal of that policy? Are we moving away from police reform, or something else going on here?
I've never supported defunding the police. Even in the time where we were taking our streets back, making a safe place for protesters in Washington, D.C. in front of the White House and affirming through public art that Black Lives Matter. My administration has always been supportive of making sure our department has the police that it needs. And so now we, in many cities around the country, are facing spikes in violence. And we're throwing every resource that we have at curbing that violence. I actually think that this COVID pandemic and the 2 years of our world really being turned on its side are impacting a lot of things, including public safety in cities across America. So for us, we have to make sure that we reverse taking money out of being able to hire good police officers. We have a thing here in Washington. We want to hire more women. We want to get to a 30% female force by 2030, and we can do it. We're already kind of ahead of the national average. We also want to hire more DC residents. So we have a very robust cadet program that focuses on hiring DC high school students. And that goes along with everything else. To deal with public, to make sure your neighborhoods are safe, it takes more than the police. It takes preventing crime before it happens, and it takes providing robust opportunities. So in DC, we lean into that too. We have a program called Building Blocks. We spent last year $58 million on alternate to police programs. We know those take time to work, and we're willing to make the long-term investment.
To get to that number of 4,000 police officers, in some cities, they're lowering the standards. Right now, we're at 3,500. If we get to 4,000, do we need to lower the standards to get to that number? Are you comfortable with the standards we have now?
We're not willing to lower our standards. And part of the reason why I separate our department from departments around the country is because we've been on the trajectory of reform for more than 20 years. We've been professionalizing our force. We require our officers to have 60 credits of college training. We require all of our officers to go through training like bystander training and de-escalation training tactics, and they all wear a body-worn camera, and we have an independent police complaints board. So we've been on this trajectory for a long time. And it's important, especially when you've dried up your pipeline for a couple of years for hiring, to get that pipeline going so that you can attract the right officers. I have put a proposal in front of my council that would allow me to hire 347, but also a retention package to try to curb the annual retention that a force our size sees every year. And if we're able to do that, we can build those numbers and get to a number where if you have to call the police, you're not waiting an inordinate amount of time for them to show up.
You mentioned the body cameras. Technology is really important, and Washington has been on the forefront of adopting some of this technology. One of it is ShopSpotter. This is the technology that can detect gunfire and give the information to police in real time. Is this kind of technology, you feel that it will help reduce gun violence? Are you confident about that technology right now?
We believe in using every tool at our disposal. And the one thing I know that while we're having an acute issue right now, this is not the DC that even I grew up in as a teenager, where we did have a lot of violence, and it wasn't safe in a lot of our neighborhoods. So we've come a long way since then, where neighborhoods all across the city are safe with great schools, fantastic parks and recreation centers. People are moving here, businesses are locating here because of the great amenities available in DC. So going into the pandemic, we saw our population growing, our businesses growing, school-age kids increasing in our schools. And so we're very focused on getting back to that trajectory. And that's really what's next for us. How do we manage this comeback? How are we bold about it? How do we leverage all of the good things that we had going into this to really enliven our downtown, get our workers back, and make sure that our residents who suffered the most during COVID are getting the relief that they need.
A resident at Ben's Chili Bowl asked me, are we going to have robot dogs in police force? Because there's some departments that have these robot dogs to help de-escalate bomb scares. The federal immigration authorities are using these kind of robot dogs. Is that something you would adopt?
I don't know about that, but I would have to ask my chief. If he thinks it's a good idea, then we want to have what's cutting edge and effective, but I don't know about it myself.
Robot dogs.
Yeah.
So you're wait and see on robot dogs.
I'll be a wait and see.
Now, this is something you've talked about, is tackling homelessness in the city. You have the Homeward DC 2000. It seeks to end long-term homelessness. Anybody that comes in the city is stark when they see lobbyists going into the Russell building and Senate with millions of dollars at stake in lobbying, and then a few blocks they see an encampment here. What's the answer? What can you do that others have tried and have failed to finally tackle this issue?
We won't fail, and we have been willing, our taxpayers have been willing to make the investments necessary to provide housing for DC residents. We know what worked in curbing family homelessness. I made a promise when I became mayor that we would make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring, that we would close a dilapidated, unsafe family shelter and build short-term shelter across the city in all 8 wards that was small and dignified and would work for families. We've been able to do that, and as a result, we're driving down family homelessness by 73%. Families are getting in housing, and they're succeeding. That's what it's going to take in the men's system as well. And we're running a pilot right now in these encampment sites, a system also upended by the pandemic. We're very proud of the fact that we didn't have COVID outbreaks in our shelters, but we also had strict protocols, which means some people decided to go outside, sleep in tents. We want them to come back in because we are a right to shelter city. We have shelter space for them, and we know when people can come into shelter, we can get them stabilized so that they can be on their way to permanent housing. On the encampments, unfortunately, there have been a couple dozen that have developed. We've already been able to offer housing in closed sites that were the most problematic, and we're going to continue to work with our unhoused residents until they're all housed.
Of course, there's been some criticism of the way that some of the encampments have been removed or shifted. What is your reaction to some of those who say it's been inhumane the way we've removed some of these encampments?
I would say there are some who think people should live in tents. I'm not one of them. Not in a city as prosperous as ours. We have the ability and we have shelter. And actually, once we get people stabilized, we can also offer housing. So that is not our value as DC residents, to have people sleeping in tents. Part of this job is making tough decisions. And we've been called on to make a lot of tough decisions, but ones that are going to be the best for the most people. And the CARE pilot, which is our encampment pilot, is an example of that. And it turns out, when you take a survey of DC residents, 3 out of 4 people would agree.
On the flip side, Washington is changing. Some say it's gentrifying, but you have unveiled this Black Home Ownership Fund and efforts to help Black-owned businesses. How can this avert all this gentrification that we see in other cities and keep some of those original descendants in their home in Washington and build legacy wealth and generational wealth?
So it's incredibly important. As I mentioned, I was born and raised in DC, and in the 70s, DC was a very different city. We actually saw probably more people leaving the city during that time than we have in recent years. Excuse me. And you know why? Because they were leaving because the schools weren't any good and the neighborhoods were unsafe. And so I believe that the renaissance of our city is directly related to a robust investment in public schools and in public safety. And when that happens, there are going to be pressures on housing. But we wouldn't want it to be the reverse. We wouldn't want to be a city where nobody wants to live or nobody wants to start a business. And so that's why we've been able to make these types of investments.
Is it important to keep that culture, the cultural aspect of the city? We're talking about Ben's Chili Bowl, we're talking about go-go music, right? That's something that is ingrained in the culture of the city, but could be lost if we're not careful.
Absolutely, and we've been able to make some very significant investments. Go-go music was made the official music of Washington, D.C. just like 2 years ago. I couldn't believe it hadn't been done already. And we are very heavily invested in our legacy initiatives, which will focus on investing in Black home ownership and getting more people to be able to own their own home.
For those who don't know go-go music, do you know a song at all from a go-go artist?
You don't want me to sing.
Oh, okay, just want to make sure. On that aspect,
allergies, you have to excuse me, are really killing me.
Something I want to ask you is, the history, Black history here is so important. I've come here and I'm constantly looking for Marvin Gaye, where he lived and thing. What can the city do? We talked about preserving some of our cultural sites, but allowing the visitor here to understand this is an emancipation city. This is deep and ingrained in our culture, and this is also the capital. Is there anything we can do to further help residents understand that history and experience it?
You raise a great point because there's been, of course, a lot of discussion of Juneteenth, and it's now a holiday. And we celebrate Emancipation Day here. And we were emancipated in DC almost a full year before the emancipation reached everybody else. And so we celebrate that with a festival. We celebrate it with a series of events in our libraries and schools. We're also very committed to making sure that our statues and streets represent prominent African Americans.
I want to ask you about Miranda, your daughter. You made the decision to adopt this child, right, and be a single mother at a time in Washington, 41% of our children are to single parents. I ask this because my grandmother did the same thing.
Amen.
Adopted my mother, and that's probably why I'm here today with you.
Amen.
You made this decision and put yourself, decided I want to be a mother, and I'm going to be a leader too. How has this affected you in your professional life? You have your parents, you have a support system, but you're critiquing the idea that being a single parent denotes you poverty, that this is a decision you can make and you can excel. So I ask you, after you've done all that, how are you doing, and would you do it again?
Oh, I would do it again in a minute. I wish I had done it again, actually, because Miranda, she's just been a blessing. She's totally changed my life. And I think what you just described is that, and people stop me and will ask me questions, is that, and I just tell them, families are made in all kinds of ways. And we should celebrate family and how people choose to make their families. And where possible, support those decisions. So I think that it is just amazing to be able to have an important policy-making job where I impact a lot of people, but then to have this little 3-year-old who really, like, already at 3, has her opinions and can run things. And
has she told you any criticism about the city, the way it's
she
run?
loves the city. She thinks it's
She does.
great. But I'll just give you a little example. I was really focused on getting my daughter to, sleep and sleep in her room and have a schedule and all that. And the other day I came home and she says, well, I want to sleep in your room. And I said, well, why? Because you can sleep in your own bed and you have a nice bed. And she just goes, well, I want to cuddle. So it is just, she's just a sweetie. And
this question came from one of our founders, and forgive me for it because I don't partake in this particular activity, but he asked, why is it still strange the way DC sells cannabis, that you have to buy a pencil in order to get a certain amount? Is that going to change or is that going to stay, this kind of quirkiness?
Well, you bring it up on a day where our council was really debating it, and it is unfortunate that we're in the position that we're in. We're really in an untenable position of having legal possession and use by adults, but the inability for the government to tax and regulate it. So what has emerged is a medical cannabis system that's suffering and a legal market that's thriving and making the city unsafe. And unfortunately, President Biden kept this anti-democratic rider in his budget proposal. So we're working very hard to get it removed in the Congress. And then that gives the local legislature the ability, just like any other state, to control and tax and regulate the sale of marijuana.
Final minute we have together here. You're running for a historic 3rd term. There is only one other mayor who has gone this far, and I think his name was Mayor Barry, right? What have you learned from the Mayor for Life? And do you model yourself on him, on some things, right? on how he ran the city?
Well, I would be lucky. Any mayor would be lucky if people loved you as much as people love Marion Barry. And for all his foibles, he was a good mayor. And he was especially a good mayor in his first term. And people, you know, the book has been written, but if you go back and look at the women he hired, the initiatives he created, and the middle class that he built. Unfortunately, a lot of it is in Maryland now, but there were a lot of bold initiatives by the mayor. And so his lasting legacies will be, I think, the summer youth program. Still, 13,000 kids can work in the summer in DC and get paid and get experience. And a lot of people that work for us now started with a summer job. And I think that building a middle class and hiring incredibly smart African Americans to be leaders of a major American city, Marion will be known and appreciated for.
Mayor Muriel Barry. I almost said Mayor Barry. Mayor Bowser.
Thank you.
Pleasure.